The voicemail was 4 minutes and 37 seconds long. Thomas Addo found it on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after his father's funeral, when he was sifting through the old man's phone to send messages to relatives living in far-flung cities, to old colleagues, the type of people who deserve to be told news by someone, not a post. He nearly deleted it without taking the time to listen. The voicemail date was on 6 years ago. It was saved as a name that didn't make sense, our architecture, and the preview only provided a few seconds of transcription before stopping. Joseph, I need you to know that I have never stopped. Thomas was on the edge of his late father's bed, in his late father's house that was now his own, in the smell of a life just departed, and pushed the play button. Out of that phone speaker in the following 4 minutes and 37 seconds emerged something that Thomas Addo would never have thought might happen. It affected his behavior towards himself, of his sister, of his mother, who died 12 years ago, of his abode in which he was seated, of the man who during the past 36 years he had been trying to become. Once he heard the voicemail. After that, he remained perfectly still for 22 minutes. He heard it again. In a way, we live our entire lives to become our parents, and the tragedy is when we find out who they are. By all accounts, Joseph Addo had been a good man. Not a perfect man. He would have refused to use that word, waved it away with a gesture he reserved for things he found dishonest or embarrassing. It's just a little scuff movement of the right hand. Without realizing, his 2 children had inherited the gesture. But good. Really, truly, and essentially good. He came to the country at the age of 22, carrying with him a suitcase, a degree from University of Ghana in engineering, and the type of ambition that never says hello because it's too busy working. He had lived here for over 40 years, patiently believing that real things take real time. He had built up a reputation in his profession and a career that was well respected. A little pretty house in a chosen and fastidiously cared for neighborhood. A real marriage, as it was. The accounts of those who had carefully watched it attest. A marriage lasting 31 years to a woman named Addo. The type of marriage which made other marriages seem like a pale shadow of what they were. Addo was dead 12 years prior. Late-diagnosed ovarian cancer progressed quickly. He had been seated at her side for 19 days, and he held her hand, and he talked to her, and he talked to her, and he talked to her, as if silence were dangerous and he was afraid of the sound of his voice tethering her. And when she finally went, at 4 a.m. on a November morning, and he had her hand, and he talked to her, and he talked to her, and he talked to her, he came out of the hospital chapel a man who had reorganized himself around an absence. He was never remarried, never had seriously been involved in any girl, to his children's knowledge. Gently and carefully brought up by Thomas or Claudia, without pushing, but rather with a desire for Joseph to have company. The topic of the father would always be closed by him making the dismissive hand sign and commenting on his age being too old to undertake such a project. He had been stricken with a heart attack on a Monday morning while making tea and died at age of 71. The paramedics reported that it was quick. Thomas chose to believe this. He had left behind the house a simple investment portfolio, a decade of professional documentation, and a phone that Thomas had never thought to check the voicemail folder for in 11 days. Thomas Addo was his father's son in all the right ways, his father's son in all the hard work ways. He had his father's engineering sensibilities, a desire to solve a problem that had a definite solution, a slight intolerance for ambiguity that he had practiced for many years in professional and personal life. He was as loyal as his father, and his father's loyalty was as unshakable as rock. He had 2 close friends he had held since he was at university, a reputation in architectural design that was just starting to make decisions, and a relationship with a woman who was 18 months old, who was firm, silent, and just what he wanted. His father's face to the best of his ability. This had been a fact that people had been saying to him. Same jaw. Same serious eyes. Much like in cases where someone was required to be very quiet. Now he was extremely quiet. His sister Claudia was down the stairs. He could hear her walking about in the kitchen where she would show her sorrow in the form of cleaning and tidying, the need to bring order to the places of disorder from death. Thomas was 3 years younger than Claudia and a secondary school principal, but her mother was as kind as Claudia, and her father as determined as Thomas, with the added gift of the firstborn child, who had lived a lifetime as the responsible one. She wasn't aware of the voicemail feature. Thomas wasn't quite sure how to tell her. After 4 minutes and 37 seconds, he wasn't certain that he knew how to tell anybody anything. He heard it for the third time with a pen in his hand. It was a female voice. Her accent, a mix of West African and British English, in itself was an indicator of the fact that she had been raised in an area between the two. Her voice was calm, but behind the calm was something so great, so restrained, so forced into the words as water into glass. Joseph, boy, that I said that we shouldn't do this anymore. I know what you did, and I have respected it for 3 years, and I'm calling you because I have no other choice if you're not listening to me. I don't care. I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to me totally. I don't want you to turn down the offer. I've settled with your decision a long time ago, and am not going to spend this call undoing what you did. I'm calling you because I have something to tell you. I can't hold it anymore. It's too large, too important. It belongs to you as well as it belongs to me, something I have been holding for 6 years. Joseph, when we broke it up, when you left for your family, and I told you I understood, I was pregnant. I need you to walk with me the rest of this message. Please. I didn't tell you because you made a choice and I had a choice, and I believed that telling you would only make everyone more difficult and no good would come of it but pain. I said to myself that for 6 years. I've done a lot of telling myself that. I've been real good about that. But he is 5 years old now, Joseph. So does he have your face? He has your exact face and your exact hands, and last week he sat at the kitchen table, and he built something out of blocks with all his concentration and patience and complete still quiet concentration that I had to take myself out of the room. I'm not asking you to leave your life. I don't ask you for anything but that you know the presence of this child, that he is real and that he's yours and his name is. The voicemail cut off. 4 minutes 37 seconds. The audio recording limit was exceeded. She had not yet had any calls back. Thomas sat on his father's bed, holding the pen in his hand and the phone on his knee, and looked at the wall and tried to find himself inside what he had heard. His father, who had been by her bedside for 19 days and chatted with her continually so that she should not feel lonely. His father, who had been doing the dismissive hand gesture at any suggestion of company since she died, because he was too old for this kind of project. His father, which Thomas had inherited a face from. His father, who had a son, somewhere, who was now 11 years old. Thomas placed the phone on its side on the bed. He put his head in his hands. Claudia's grief took over her father's kitchen, where she rearranged it, downstairs, just as it did everything else, without knowing that the man she mourned had been a man she never knew. This is the dead's most cruel and merciless thing, that they cannot explain themselves. Thomas didn't tell Claudia that day. He said to himself that this was because he needed time to think, to understand what he was being faced by before he brought it into his sister's grief, which was raw and voracious, and didn't yet have the scar tissue that makes more wounds survivable. This was to some extent true. Truthfully, he had not yet formed his opinion. Thomas Addo himself had never been able to communicate anything that he didn't understand. That night, when he went home to his apartment, he was met with silence from Serena and a glass of water on the table with her sitting next to him, her shoulders touching his. He cherished her in particular for this, for understanding when words were not enough, and deciding to be present. He didn't tell her either. Not yet. He left it on his own for 4 days. Those 4 days took him through different stages of being sad and angry, and being sad because he found out that someone he loved was more complicated than he realized. An object that contained everything of that sort, and something else. The sensation that it was an acknowledgement, somehow, beneath all else. Before he was even a father, he knew his father was a man. Had known this on a mental level, had been grown out enough and curious enough about this human being, Joseph, to ask questions and listen to the answers. He was aware his father had been a young man at one time, had wanted things, had made choices. He did not know about this option. On the 4th day, he checked his computer and located the contact. Architecture was not a company. It was a person. He did some digging, and he discovered her, a woman named Ruth Asante, through a string of digital breadcrumbs, patient but not knowledgeable. An architect, located in a city 4 hours from where she is. She was an entrepreneur, with her own little business. There was a professional photo of her on her website, a serious, clear, expressionless face, a woman's face, in the mid to late 40s. He located a photo of her firm's staff on the website. There, in the back row, with the intern's name listed, and one can imagine quite young but taken photos recently, was a boy. Thomas examined the boy's face for a very long time. His father's jaw. His father's serious eyes that were like a man on fire. The attitude his father had on being a little away from the crowd, as though he might need a bit more room in order to think clearly. Thomas's jaw. Thomas's eyes. His brother. He greeted Claudia on a Sunday. He drove to the house, their father's house, and probably for years to come, and he set her at the kitchen table, and he put the phone between them, and he pressed play. Claudia was paying close attention, as if she had been asked to do so but hadn't yet made the choice. The voicemail ended. It was utterly silent in the kitchen. Then Claudia commented, "Play it again." He played it again. The second time, she got up and walked into the kitchen, stood, faced away from him, both hands on the edge of the counter, and remained silent for a long time. At last, she asked, "How long have you known?" 4 days. 4 days. She said it without any intonation. Processing. "I had to know about it before He lied to us." Her voice was very soft. "For 12 years, during Mum's dying days, after Mum's death. He was sitting with us in this kitchen, and he had a child somewhere, and he never," she stopped. "He never said, 'We're not sure what the entire story is. We know enough.'" She turned around. Her face had a complicated expression, not of grief nor of anger, but of that kind of devastation that someone who has been changed in the most basic of ways has. "We know that he's got a son. We know there's an 11-year-old boy somewhere who has Dad's face and doesn't know his father is dead." The final sentence hit the kitchen as if it had been thrown. But Thomas hadn't thought of it quite like this yet. The boy had no idea. One can never choose one's family. At times, rarely, terrifyingly, beautifully, one can choose what to do with one's family. They located Ruth Asante on the Thursday. Not by subterfuge. Thomas was not designed to be a subterfuge. He just sent her an email. Simple and judicious. He was Joseph Addo's son. He had found a voicemail on his father's telephone. He had understood that she was probably not welcome to hear his father's message, but that they should let her know that her father had died, and, if she would like to speak with him, he would very much like to speak with her. He read it a total of 4 times. Demonstrated it to Serena. Made 2 alterations to sentences according to her recommendations. Sent it. That night, he didn't sleep well. Her reply came the next morning at 6:43. It was 4 sentences. "Thomas, I'm so sorry for your loss. I heard of your father's death, and I would like to talk to you and your sister when you're ready." He phoned her that afternoon. The voice on the phone was true to the voicemail, composed, precise, the speaker's hybrid cadence, the person who had lived between places. But older now. The 6 years of voicemail and this conversation had brought some of this to her voice for Thomas to recognize, as he had heard it in his own voice after difficult times. A person who has worked very hard for himself and who understands the cost. She said she wouldn't apologize. If she had known what to do with it, he would not have expected her to and wouldn't have, as she didn't. In that phone call, she explained to him things that changed the way he thought about his parents' marriage, not ruined, but changed. When Thomas was in the mid-20s, his parents were in a very difficult period in life, and he knew that. Like all adult children who have moved out that know the hopelessness of their parents' lives, but only peripherally. He knew that there was some friction. Did not know how deep it was. At that time, Joseph had met Ruth professionally. It had become, after 2 years, something they had never wanted, and both had ultimately decided to stop. Joseph had made his choice of a wife. Returned to Addo with recommitment, as Ruth termed it, without bitterness, full and whole. "He had a great love for your mom," Ruth said. "I want you to understand that. I told you, that's what happened between me and you. That's what, I won't demean you by saying that's what happened between me and you. That's what, but what he had with your mother, that was of a completely different order. but he was not aware of, but
No. A pause.
I had for 6 years told myself not to tell him, and then Elijah sat at that kitchen table and started building with blocks, and I picked up the phone before I could think myself out of it. Another pause. The recording limit. I've never made a voicemail that long before. I didn't know it would get cut off. Have you made another attempt? A pause which responded before her. She said quietly. I called back twice. He did not reply. Yes, I don't know. I told myself that was also an answer. With this, Thomas sat. What is Elijah's knowledge? Asked he. About his father. That his father was a good man, but that he was not able to be around him, that I have never lied to him, never told him more than he could hear, at any age that he was at. A breath. Now he's 11 years old. He's ready for more. Does he understand his father had passed away? This silence was more protracted. No, Ruth said, not knowing how. Thomas closed his eyes.
We would like to meet him, he said.
If you believe that's something that could work, he has family. He has a brother and a sister, and they didn't know of his existence until 11 days ago, and we would like him to know that. For a long time Ruth Asante was silent. Her voice was no longer as composed. It was her first time in the conversation. He looks just like your father, she said.
He has his hands.
His concentration. When he needs it, he goes completely still. Thomas responded, I know. I saw the picture of him. In that case, you already know him already, she said. Yes, Thomas said. I think I do. There are times when a brother is not a brother of your birth. Sometimes he's somebody you know in a room full of strangers, and you pick up on him right away, like you know with your whole body, that the distance between us has always been wrong. They met in a neutral city, halfway between Thomas and Claudia's city and Ruth's, on a Saturday afternoon. A coffee shop.
Public.
Comfortable. Ruth's choice, and Thomas appreciated the wisdom of it, the implicit message that this wasn't a confrontation or event, but people sitting in the same space starting the work of knowing each other. Thomas and Claudia were the first ones to arrive. Claudia had been silent in the car, not the interior silent of acute grief, but more interior. She was processing. After all, Thomas had spent 3 decades and a little over a decade at the breast as a sister. He had learned that she needed her time for processing. They ordered coffee, sat at a corner table, waited. Elijah was with her, and she arrived on time. Thomas saw him first, then them, and had about 3 seconds to calm himself down, and then Elijah looked up and across the coffee shop and their eyes locked. There wasn't enough time for the 3 seconds. But Claudia had made a sound next to him, and he knew it because it had to be. It was almost imperceptible, but he knew it because it was what he was saying to himself. 11 years old, Elijah Asante was their father. Not metaphorically, not as a similarity, resemblance, or a family echo. At 11, he was Joseph Addo, walking across a coffee shop in a city he had never been to with that expression of careful, serious, complete attention that both of his elder siblings had lived with all their lives and not known where it had come from. He then sat opposite to them. He gazed at Thomas. He was gazing at Claudia. Giving the direct blitzer the face of his father, he said, "You have my dad's face." Claudia's calmness, that she had been keeping up for longer than she could remember since the voicemail, made a sound of something giving way. "But do, Thomas," Thomas said. Elijah sat and thought, as his father had once done, and nodded. Mum said. He saw his hands resting on the table. His hands on his father's table. She said he died. Yes, Thomas said. 11 days ago. The boy stopped and said, was he reorganized? Was he good? The question was quick and damning, and was delivered in a direct manner that a child would have waited years to ask and finally given the opportunity to ask. At 11 years old, Thomas looked at his brother, at his father's face, who had been built from the same material and had lived in a different world, who didn't know there was a world built of this material, whose only duty was to provide for him, who had no purpose. Thomas said that he was the best man he knew. And I think he was more complicated than I realized, and I think he was more complicated than I thought he was going to be. This gravity was almost too much for Elijah to take. Finally, he said, okay. Then Ruth put her hand on her son's hand on the table, and Claudia, who had lost her temper completely, put her hand on Ruth's, and Thomas sat at a table in a coffee house in a neutral city in the middle of the Saturday afternoon and saw the family his father had left behind, all of it, all the complicated, unplanned, love-soaked wreckage of a good man's fully human life, and felt something move through him, something that was grief and gratitude and fury and tenderness all at once. He reached across. He placed his hand on his head. Forgiveness is a choice you make each day until it is the reality. The succeeding months were far from easy. Thomas had not been expecting it, and he was thankful he didn't receive it. Simple would have seemed like a lie, a mellowing over that ought to have been savored in all its texture. He and Claudia were mad at their father for a long time. This was fitting and needed, and they gave it its due. They were angry at the deceit, at the years of Sunday dinners and honest talk and the intimate closeness of a close family which they had experienced within a silence that was roomy enough to hold a whole person. They were mad about the voicemail that ended before the name. Most of all, they were angry because they could not face a corpse with the truth that they had denied him. They also, which was more tricky, were angry at themselves for still being in love with him. Because they couldn't. The thing about Joseph Addo was that he had been in the full, human truth, the truth that he was the father of Ruth and Elijah, and that she and he were part of his life, and so was a chapter of his, a man worth loving. The complexity didn't detract from the quality. It made it more real, if it's possible, more dimensional, more honest. In one of their talks, Thomas asked Ruth, was he afraid? And she replied, yes, he was afraid. The connection between the two began to take form, but it didn't happen right away. Not of us, but of what knowing would cost everyone. He made the calculation wrong. I think he always knew he made the calculation wrong. He couldn't find the door back through it. Thomas told us. He should have told us. Yes, Ruth replied in a straightforward manner. He should have. There was nothing more to say about that. So they went on. In December, Elijah started visiting for a weekend, the first of many. Thomas took him from the train station and they drove to the house, Joseph's house, which by now was slowly growing into the house of everything Joseph had left, and which Elijah walked through, with focused and quiet attention, like someone who is memorizing a place. He stopped in the study. Joseph's table for writing remained, yet still strewn with the tidy, orderly debris of a working engineer, project files, technical drawings, a pile of pencils, sorted by length, an unconscious precision that was entirely his. Elijah stood before it and did not touch it, but looked at it for a long time. He then held one of the pencils in his hand, gave it a spin in his hands, place in his pocket. He wondered at Thomas, not asking permission, not apologizing, only a check to make sure Thomas knew what this was. Thomas knew what it was.
There are more in the drawer, he said.
If you want them. Elijah opened the drawer. He picked up another 3 pencils and placed them in his pocket, carefully, as if they were valuable. That night, the 3 of them, Thomas and Claudia and Elijah, were seated at the kitchen table, and Claudia made something to eat, because emotion had to somewhere, and they talked about Joseph. Not around him, not just by the backs of his head, directly, not the stories he was made up of, not the stories he was complicated by, but the stories that made him human, the stories that made him worth knowing. He nearly lost his way driving to a work site that he had been to 100 times, and he spent 45 minutes trying to figure out where he was before he finally admitted it. When he cried at some movies, he cried, but never showed a change in his face besides one tear, which he seemed to think no one noticed. He was absolutely sure his jollof rice was better than any other jollof rice, and wasn't a matter of discussion with him.
For the first time, Elijah laughed.
It was his mother's laugh, not like Joseph at all. Arriving warm, without warning, and staying longer than expected. Thomas heard the best news he'd heard in months.
Some things have not been completed because they were not left incomplete, but rather left to be completed by the right people. Thomas left the voicemail. In the first weeks he had thought about deleting it, but in like manner as you consider deleting something hurtful from your environment if the hurt is still fresh. He had thought it was not the right thing to do. The voicemail was right on the money. It was a part of the record of what really had happened, and Thomas was a man who was very particular about that record. Once more, on the evening of Elijah's first visit, after his brother had gone to bed in the guest room and Claudia had driven home, after the house had been quiet in those first 11 days, but quietly now. Not empty. Filled with another kind of being. He pressed play. After hearing Ruth say to his father on his porch, "Joseph, I need you to know that I never stopped." He listened all 4 minutes and 37 seconds of silence to the silence that followed. After that, he hung up the telephone. He was sitting in his father's kitchen for a long time. He thought of Joseph Addo at any age he was at when this person made this voicemail message, and he sat, perhaps in this same kitchen, listening to the voice he left, what he chose, what the price of his choosing had been. The thought of his father pressing delete came to him. Or, why not delete, and why not? He considered a man who held a secret of form like a child for 6 years. He considered his pencils in his pocket and thought of Elijah. He considered his mother's 31 years of having been loved by a man who was all right, and all wrong, and all over again. He considered the drafting table in the study. Patient, focused, quiet at a kitchen table, for hours from here. About how the face had been everyone's face and no one's face, and how the stillness had come upon it when something needed full attention. He pondered the meaning of inheriting a man. Not the one you were issued with. The full version. The one that contained the good and the bad of his life, the love and the absence of love, the things that he created and the things that he was not able to find the door back through. He chose to have the complete version instead. He switched off the light in the kitchen. He went to see his brother. Elijah slept with one hand on his cheek, his father's face calm and quiet, younger than he'd ever seen in his father's life. 4 pencils are lined up on a nightstand, longest to shortest. Thomas was standing in the door for a long time, after which he carefully closed the door. He lay down in a more complicated and larger family than he had a month ago, a more true family, and in the sleep of that night, he slept better than he had since the call that started it all. He called, he didn't call, he was awake in the room of a man he had known, holding a phone that he had almost not picked up. The final time was 4:37. The secret is a word that is long. A secret word that is long. The beginning of a family. Before you go, consider the people in your life who are carrying something too big to say. Tell them this. Not with a message. Just share it. A story won't say some things we could not. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. I'll be honest, but this one is nothing in comparison to the next story in the series.
He was going through his dead father's phone looking for contacts to notify.
There.
He almost didn't check the voicemail folder. The voicemail was 6 years old. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. And it ended before she said the name.